I read 14 dark and paranormal romance books in 14 days, and today I want to talk about The Words by Ashley Jade. This is a Rockstar romance that's a little lighter on the dark romance spectrum. There's definitely some content in here that could bother some folks, but as far as dark romance goes, it's pretty tame. So the story spans basically 5 or 6 years of these two characters, and it starts when they're in high school, and basically the first 25% of the book is all backstory. Most of the heavier content is in that first 25% because that's basically where all of the conflict is seated, and not just the conflict between the characters, but a lot of their personal struggles start in that first 25% when they're still in high school. And although these two characters are technically 18, they're just barely by a couple months, and I'm not a fan of barely legal content. I'm not a fan of YA romance. I just don't like it. So if that sort of thing is really going to bother you, or if any of the other content warnings on the screen are going to make you uncomfortable or make you upset, definitely skip this video. We are going to talk about some things that are going to make some folks uncomfortable. And although this is probably the mildest of all the dark romance books that I read for the Bloody Valentine series, I think it probably made me the most uncomfortable because of a lot of the bullying stuff that happened, which is a weird reaction to have when you're reading things like Haunting Adeline and just sort of shrugging it off, or you're reading like serial killer romance and just sort of shrugging it off, but this really bothered me, so it's just something to be aware of. You know, everybody's got their own baggage, so if any of this stuff is going to make you uncomfortable or bother you, just skip this video. While we're on the topic of content warnings, YouTube has a tendency to not particularly like when people are talking about topics like this, or dark romance books in general. So if you want to help me out and help train the YouTube algorithm to give you more dark romance content by me and other people who are reviewing these kinds of books, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Like I said, it does me a massive favor, and it also helps train the algorithm to give you more of the content that you actually want. So I want to talk about some of the things in this book that worked and some of the things that I think could have been done a bit better. But before I do, I'm going to need to go over the plot. Now, if you are super sensitive to spoilers, or you don't want to know what the main conflict is in this book, you can always skip the plot summary by using the timestamps down below. Anything with spoilers in it is very clearly marked, like in all of my book review videos. Okay, so we start off with Lennon, who is top of her class, ready to go to Dartmouth. Her dad is a music guy. He's a songwriter with a few successful singles under his belt. And Phoenix, who is a guy from the wrong side of the tracks, who has a really rough home life and the voice of an angel. Phoenix is having a hard time at school due to undiagnosed dyslexia, and their English teacher has asked Lennon to help Phoenix graduate. He needs to pass the final in order to graduate on time, and if he doesn't, they're going to have to hold him back a year, which basically means Phoenix isn't going to get to graduate because his home life is so bad and he is in such a hurry to get out of there, not only to go and start his life as a rock star, because he wants to be a rock musician, but also to get away from his home life, because it's really volatile, it's very violent. So basically, if he doesn't pass the final, he's not going to graduate, and then he's not going to have a diploma at all, which, you know, nobody just steps into being a rock star, right? Like, you've got to work a regular job first while you're trying to make your bones. So Lennon doesn't really have anything else going on because she doesn't really have any friends, so she agrees to help him. And here's where the conflict starts, right? So Lennon has always had a crush on Phoenix, although they've never actually spoken. He's basically like cock of the walk in their school. He's super hot. He's a bit of a man whore. He sleeps with all the popular girls, and those popular girls ruthlessly bully Lennon about her weight. She's a little heavier. She's a little socially awkward, and they just give her a hell of a time. And some of the things that they say and do to her were tremendously uncomfortable to read. So if you have been bullied, you might have a hard time with this book, specifically if you've been bullied about your weight. I was a little heavier in high school, and there are definitely some people who gave me a hard time about it. It was hard to read. And her internalization about it, her emotional state, while this is happening and after, and sort of what happens to her mentally and emotionally when she's alone, in particular, alone with her thoughts, alone in her room with a mirror, it's really hard to read. So if that's something that's going to bother you, definitely don't read this book. It stirs up a lot of bad memories. So basically, over the last few months of the school year, their senior year, while Lennon is tutoring Phoenix and sort of figuring out that he has dyslexia, and then figuring out how to help him get over it or work around it without exposing himself to other people, because he's really intent on other people not knowing that he has a really hard time reading. They sort of get to know each other and develop a respect for one another on a really intimate level, and they become really good friends. And Phoenix eventually just tells these girls, like, fuck off, like, you're picking on my friend, I'd rather spend time with her than you, go away. And Lennon actually opens up and lets somebody in and lets him in, and allows herself to be vulnerable to someone, Phoenix, because he actually sees her for who and what she is rather than just her body. And of course that leads into Lennon and Phoenix having feelings for each other, and sort of right before graduation or right after graduation, they decide that they're going to kind of give it a try. They're going to make a go of it. And although she's going off to one coast and he's going off to the other, and they're going to be literally on opposite sides of the country, they want to see if they can make it work. That is until Phoenix and his bandmate secure a gig at a local bar. Now, this is days before they're set to head off to California. And they were just going to go play a show. They've been doing it for a while. And then they discover that there's going to be a rock label record exec there. And he's going to be looking for something unique. Now, Phoenix and his bandmate Storm tend to play cover music. They don't have any original music of their own because neither of them are songwriters. So basically, this guy is going to be looking for something original, something new, and they don't have anything. What he does have is Lennon's song. So Lennon writes music just kind of as a way to get her emotions out about all of the things that have happened to her. And the only person she's ever shared that with is Phoenix. He's the only one that she's ever been vulnerable with. He's the only one that knows that she actually writes these songs, this music. And she performed one of them for him, sort of in a very intimate moment. And he steals it from her and doesn't give her credit. So the record exec is really impressed. And he signs the boys on the label and fills in the extra two band members with these other two kids that are really talented. And yeah, Phoenix becomes a rock star. The single's a hit, and he shoots up into superstardom, but he loses Lennon. Yeah, so I understand why all of that was included, and all of that investment emotionally in those characters at that young and vulnerable age, when both of them desperately needed somebody to cling to, was necessary for the impact of the rest of the story. Fast forward 4 years, and like many young rock stars, Phoenix is spiraling out of control. He is drinking, he's doing drugs, he's basically sleeping his way across the country. He and a bandmate get really messed up and go driving, which obviously is not going to end well. And they get in a massive wreck, and he nearly dies. The bandmate does die, and they kill a mother and a pregnant woman and her young son. And he can't live with the guilt of what he's done. In addition to that awful, awful night where the car accident occurred, he's been tearing himself up for 4 years about what he did to Lennon. And basically, he forms no emotional attachments to anybody else because he's still heartbroken over losing her. So in an effort to sort of get Phoenix back on track, his best friend Storm, his original bandmate from high school, he's still part of the band, and he and the manager worked to sort of hire sober companions for him to try and get him to clean up a little bit. The problem is Phoenix is incredibly charismatic and an absolute party animal, and he keeps sort of like dragging these sober companions down with him rather than them lifting him up. So he's drinking and drugging with them, he's sleeping with them, and they basically just become party buddies for him rather than somebody who's actually helping him clean himself up. And the manager's basically at his last straw. And finally, they're like, we need somebody who would never sleep with him, who would like the furthest thing from their mind. And Storm's like, I actually know somebody. And he recommends that they hire Lennon as Phoenix's sober companion. Now, this is 4 years later. Storm does not know about the stolen song. He thinks that Lennon and Phoenix split up because Phoenix was cheating on her or slept with one of the bully girls, you know, and she basically walked in on them right before this show because Phoenix set it up so that she would see that, so that she would go away and she wouldn't hear him perform their song. So yeah, Lennon gets hired on by the band manager because her dad is really sick and she's desperate for the money. She had to drop out of school and try to take care of him, and she needs the money, and it's a lot of money. It's several $100,000, and basically all she has to do is make it through 8 weeks of their American tour and not let him get in trouble. And she'll make all this money and be able to take care of her dad. So she begrudgingly agrees to it, and then the rest of the book is them sort of navigating one another and all of the damage and trauma that they have caused to one another over the course of their relationship. So let's talk about some of the things that I liked in this book and some of the things I think could have been done a little differently or a little better. Overall, I liked the characters. I thought that they were pretty complex. They had more to them than just each other and just their trauma related to one another. There were other things going on that were making these characters really struggle to open up to one another. So that was good to see. I think the first 25% was better characterization than the rest of the book. I do feel like as adults in their early 20s, 22, 23, that they were a little immature. And it could just be that my perception is skewed. One, I'm 42, so trying to relate to characters in their early 20s is a little difficult for me. But I do remember what being that age was like and what I was doing at that age and sort of where I was mentally and emotionally. The problem is when you're looking back 20 years, your lens is skewed, right? So I can't relate to the emotional state, but I do know what I was doing at that time. And these kids feel immature and underdeveloped. These characters should have grown up between the first 25% of the book, which is when they were in high school, and the rest of the book, which is when they were meant to have been like 4 years, 5 years later. They were supposed to be grown up a little bit, have a little more life experience, and they don't feel any different. They don't feel any more mature. They don't feel any more grown up. And I think that was unfortunate because there was definitely opportunity there for them to have grown a bit. And I guess Phoenix did spiral, but he still feels like that sort of petulant, angry teenage boy, and he's just sort of permanently infantilized. And Lennon is absolutely trapped by her past. She hasn't grown at all. There are also some of their reactions that feel over the top and completely disproportional. In particular, the one that stuck out to me the most was Lennon's reaction to her father's death. It felt like too much. She basically shuts down for months. 2 months, I think, is what it is, 6 to 8 weeks. And the reaction that she had, you can see happening if it's your spouse that you lose or your child that you lose. But an adult losing a parent, even as young as she is, even at 22 or 23, like, yeah, of course that's going to be devastating. Of course it's going to be heartbreaking. But like, to the point that you can't function at all, like you're not even getting out of bed for 2 months, it just didn't seem realistic to me. And I know that everybody grieves in their own way. And if that is something that happened to you, I am not judging you or here to tell you that you're grieving wrong. Like that's not what this is. It is an unusual and disproportionate reaction. And that's why it didn't really ring true for me. That's not a spoiler, by the way. The fact that there's something wrong with her dad is telegraphed from the very first page. Literally the first page opens with, you can tell that there's not something quite right with him. And it just sort of slowly builds over time. So when the inevitable like diagnosis comes through, it's not a surprise, because you see it coming, and that's intentional by the author's design. One of the things I will say that this book does really well is get you invested in these characters. So yes, absolutely, some of their reactions felt immature or disproportionate. There's a lot of the like wailing and gnashing of teeth that was a little too dramatic. But these are two broken, lonely people who only ever had each other, and they've lost it. And you really feel for them. And I think that one of the reasons that you're able to is because you see them come together. So basically, the first 25% is their first love story, and then the rest of it is them trying to put themselves back together from the devastation of the loss of that love. And watching that happen, like, you do get invested in them. And I think that one of the reasons you're able to is because of that first 25%. Just because overall I liked this book and I liked the characters, doesn't mean that I think everything was perfect. So let's talk about some of the things that I think could have been done a little bit better. There were a lot of subplots in this book that were hammered on really hard and were basically unnecessary. There are characters that are completely superfluous, or could have been in a little bit and then should have been sort of phased out and blacked out and dropped. There's a whole side story with like Phoenix's sister that wasn't necessary at all. Like, you could remove her from the book. His mom still would have left for the same reason. And she basically could have shown up at a show, or he could have found her in a Waffle House or something. Like, there were so many other options that didn't have this extra like weird 12-year-old character or 14-year-old character roaming around. Likewise with Skylar and Memphis and Chadwick, or Chandler, I think his name is, the manager. Those characters needed to be in the book. We didn't need to have like full devastation of their stories and all of that. Basically, when Skylar left the first time after Josh's death, that basically should have been the last time we saw her. We did not need this full like sidebar subplot. It just wasn't necessary. I believe that the author has written a second book about Skylar and Chandler and Memphis. And that's really where that story goes. It really belongs in its own story if that's where you want to write it. So basically, because of all this distraction and because all of these side plots are carried all the way through to a logical conclusion, in a completely unnecessary way, like, you could completely remove those two stories and nothing would change in the main characters' arcs. It would have been just as impactful, arguably more impactful, because you wouldn't have been distracted. And so it's basically a 676 page book that really should have been like 3 to 350. So it became very tedious to read. And even if all you did was remove the side romance and remove the kid sister, it still would have cut it down a lot and made it a lot easier to get through. As it was a bit of a slog, and I found that I was just constantly checking, how far am I? How many pages do I have left? Like, why are we still talking about this? So it wasn't just these side plots. There were also things where like Phoenix would like rehash over and over his mommy trauma. And yes, he needs to deal with that in like a slow graduating way, but like that's not really what it felt like. It was just basically the same raw open wound brought up over and over and over again, and just constantly hammering on that subplot. So I feel like the book got distracted with its subplots, and it would have been better off staying focused on the main story. Another major complaint that I have is in the last 15 to 20% of the book, the characters start telling what's going on instead of showing you, like rather than you living through the experience with them, they're just basically telling you what's going on in their head. They use a lot of psychobabble or psychological terms, and basically self-diagnose themselves and each other. And it's very like jarring and out of sync with the rest of the book, and also pulls you out of your immersion. For most of the book, you're right there with them, and then this last like 15 to 20%, they're just sort of telling you, oh, well, because of this trauma, I have this red flag. And it's like, okay, like, yeah, I know, but like, why are you telling me? I'm supposed to figure that out on my own. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of psychobabble in books, particularly like self-diagnosed psychobabble in books. And I feel like it detracted significantly from the closure that you got, because there was no like ability for the characters to realize what they were missing and fill those voids on their own, because they were basically just talking about it like in their heads. It was very fourth wall breaking and not in a good way. My final complaint, and this is going to be entirely subjective, is the dirty talk. To be fully upfront, I'm not a huge fan of super explicit sex scenes, and I'm really not a fan of dirty talk, but the dirty talk in this book was so corny. It basically feels like what you would expect a teenage boy to say. And like I said, these characters don't ever feel like they really mature or really grow up. And Phoenix, like some of the stuff that he says is just like, are you 14? Like, what is this? Is this supposed to be sexy? And maybe it's just me, maybe it's just personal taste. That's entirely possible. But I found that the dirty talk and the things he was saying and the way that he was saying it really detracted from like the steaminess of it because it was just so like anyway, so that's just me. That was my experience with the words. The story overall was good. The characters overall were investable. They were something that you could get invested in, but the book was entirely too long, twice as long as it needed to be in order to tell the story that it really should have been telling. It feels like it got distracted with subplots and became extremely repetitive, hammering on the same traumas and the same concepts over and over. In a really direct way. There was no subtlety or subtext. And yeah, it was good, but it could have been a lot better. Anyway, that's all I've got for this one. If you liked this video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Not only does it help me out, it also trains YouTube's algorithm to give you more dark romance content by me and other creators. If you want to support me and what I'm doing here, you can do that on Patreon, or feel free to join the Discord and come and chat with us about books and writing and life in general. There's a whole bunch of links to social media down below. I'm going to be doing some Twitch readings, live readings, read-alongs of books, and sort of like on-the-fly analysis as we go along here in the next few months. That'll start. So follow me on Twitch if you haven't already. And yeah, thanks for hanging out. I'll see you in the next one.